You're listening to the Makers and Mystics podcast. This is your host, Stephen Roach. This is Season 2, Episode 11, Part 2 of my conversation with Josh Garrels on vocation and calling.
To laugh and dance and safety among the shimmering light and the shade of the trees. Steal a bite and paradise is lost. With darkened hearts we didn't count the cost. Forgot all we left behind.
I know a lot of your songs obviously deal with spiritual themes, but the thing that I love about your lyrics and the thing that I love about your songs is that the spiritual components of your lyrics play out in the grit of everyday life. And what I mean by that is, like, whether you're singing about your marriage or whether you're singing about wrestling with doubts or whether you're telling a story about someone else's life, your lyrics paint this picture of God in the midst of it all.
Yeah. Which
I love. It's got graffiti to it, it's got that street feeling to it, and it's real. I just wanted to say it's really refreshing to hear that perspective on spirituality and the everyday life coming together, especially when a lot of times in the culture at large, if you mention music with a Christian element, you immediately think of like this detached sentimentality, or this this music with overused metaphors and generalizations, breaking the chains and stuff like that.
Yep.
But I'm curious to know a little bit about your process with your lyric writing and what moves you to write with that raw honesty that you've come to be known for.
Well, I think early on, and it's still a driving force for me, is I want to make the music that I've been longing to hear, which I think is a valid motivation,
Yeah.
Like, there's music that I want to hear, and that married to the big story, the biblical narrative. Because, man, I came to faith as like a 20-year-old. So there's this sense that I was awestruck and like, man, I was T-boned by the Holy Spirit, like I didn't want to come in, and it smashed me, and showed me reality like a matrix was so much different than what I thought it was, Yeah. And I think for several years that, oh man, the reality of the Lord was so intense. But I wasn't hearing a ton of music that really spoke into that. You know what I mean? Like, like this life that I've been living that I'm actually passionate about. I love art and like skateboarding and whatever the cultural things were that I was into. Like, he's not unconcerned with all of that. He's in the midst of it, So there was that sense, if you want to call it incarnation, of like, okay, man, I like reading these words that are 2,000 years old. They're making me weep. How do I translate those into my life? Which really I think is incarnational art. There's incarnational ways of living. If you're not an artist, how do we take these realities and translate them into our life? Like, what does this parable mean in my time for me? You know what I mean? And so I think that's always been a driving force with the songs is, okay, I'm learning this deep spiritual lesson, or this scripture that I've read 1,000 times all of a sudden just came alive. Why did it come alive? Well, because there was a need in my life that, like, that scripture it was like the perfect keyhole into that need in my life, and it opened it up, and that word became alive to me. And so then as an artist, I can choose to sing those words verbatim, which sometimes there's a place for that, singing a psalm verbatim. But we all know there are times where we've heard a thing so many times, like reading it 1,000 times and not fully getting it. I think that's why God creates some of us to be creators, is he's like, okay, I've given you the gift of taking this thing, I just opened it up to you, now I want you to translate that into your culture, into your peer group, into your time. And that's the incarnation for us, There are times that I know I've been successful. There are times I know that I haven't, But I think that is a driving force, is like, how do we treat his truth honorably, not compromising, but translating it into our time and space,
Yeah.
In many ways, I've viewed songs increasingly, and sort of, if you want to call them, like a parabolic nature. The Lord, with his parables, was talking about things that were contextual to his time that everyone understood. If you want to say the earthiness, the grittiness of his time, he's talking about like planting trees and harvesting and mustard seeds and kneading dough and, man, like Hebrew life in the turn of the century, you know what I mean? Like in his time period. And I think for us, there's that similar call to like, okay, so there's this spiritual truth that is eternal, and we'll just keep opening up for eternity. But how do we bring that into a storyline that's understood, into a drama that is understood? How does that connect with the crisis of our time? Because it's made to connect, but sometimes I think for whatever reason he calls upon us to actually make that connection and voice the connection so others can understand the connection between those two things. Right. And often I think it's through simple stories, man, where it's like, I've often said it's almost like viewing reality through a gospel lens, which is what happened to me when I came to faith. Like, reality didn't change, but now I have this new lens through which I'm viewing everything, And so I think powerful art isn't necessarily changing reality or completely revolutionizing everyone's worldview, but it's actually like giving people a perspective of what's happening that is like good and true and helpful,
Yeah, that's good. A lot of times it can seem like we're trying to answer questions that no one is asking. You know what I mean? And I guess what I mean is, like, as an artist of faith or as a Christian artist, there's an expectation to always provide the answer. You can talk about this difficulty you went through, but we got to clinch the deal. We got to bring it home. We got to give the answer. And I know ultimately, as Christians, we do believe Jesus is the culmination. Jesus is the answer, the relationship with him. But the artist's role is to help people know what questions we should be asking, rather than just providing these answers. And so I think it would almost seem that providing answers within your lyrics or art can be a qualifying characteristic of why somebody would characterize it as Christian music. Because a lot of people deal with faith and spiritual topics that aren't necessarily coming from a Christian worldview. But when I look at, say, Psalm 88, the last line is basically, I'm all alone, where are you, God? End of story. There are these, and so it ends with a question rather than an answer. And I think my question for you is, do you feel compelled as a believer in Jesus to provide answers through your music? Does it have to lead somewhere? Or do you feel okay just compelling people to ask the questions or to wrestle through things and come into their own conclusions?
I think my answer would be, it depends on which song I'm writing. There are times where I do feel compelled to sort of pull out the sword, if you will. Like, this is like the word, this is true, and this is going to go against, this is going to be countercultural to the culture I live in, like saying like, this is a true thing, therefore there are false things, This is a true statement.
Yes.
Man, in this wishy-washy time, living in Portland, Oregon, where sort of the slogan is everyone just be nice, coexist, bumper sticker, like hyper liberal, but strangely enough, very, very opposed to someone who would just sort of take a stand for like, no, I really believe this particular thing is true.
Yeah.
That's frowned upon. That's not acceptable, you know?
Wow.
So I do, sometimes there's a compulsion to be like, you know, some people are not going to like this, you know?
Yeah.
Like there are going to be people who write this off if I say this, but I feel like I'm supposed to say it. Intuitively, it will emasculate this song if I don't take it here, you know? But then there are other songs that are like, man, this song is tender, and I have an intuitive sense that this song is going to reach out to others who are questioning, hurting, searching, and it's going to draw people into something, you know? And I don't have to like give the treatise, the orthodox treatise to like what right belief is, so that if they do get drawn in, I want to make sure we get it right. They gotta know fully like what I mean. I gotta be perceived correctly, you know, like, because I think that's a fear within the family of faith, is that we always need to be perceived correctly. The Lord was not always perceived correctly, you know, just read the stories. So there is, depending on the song, there are others that I've tried to, like, out of that compulsion to be perceived correctly, I've tried to strong arm a song into being too didactic, too trying to teach. And my wife is awesome, man. Michelle, she'll sit back and go like, I don't think that's what that song wants to say. And I'll be like, you're right, you know, and I'll take it back, you know, to like, okay, this song is tender. This song, it can just be about like this one simple emotion played out in this storyline, you know, and that's okay. You know, that's I'm not compromising myself or the honor of the Lord by like letting this song be tender and just universally understood as a tender thing, you know? But those who've listened enough know that there are other songs that I feel like I'm not going to pussyfoot around this one, though. Like, this song actually wants to go there, and I'm going to let it go there, and it's equally a step of faith of like, it's the curse of being an intuitive person at times, is I know often how something is going to be perceived.
For sure.
And so if anything, I have to work against my cowardice of like, I could say that in a way that's a little more universal or tasteful, but if it's grating against the Spirit in me, and the Spirit's hairs are kind of standing up, like, and him saying like, hey man, no, like, this is a time you speak. And I like, all right, I'll speak. I'll say it, I guess, you know.
What's one of your songs that you would say carries that boldness that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, I think any song where you're saying the name Jesus, first of all, it puts it right in that place. There, yeah. Right in that place, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't know, man. There are songs like, you know, The Resistance, or others where there's a certain, like, for lack of better terms, like a fire boldness that goes along with it, you know? Or even when you perform those ones live, I'll like feel like sort of a fire in my throat, a fire in my bones, and I'll feel my eyes get kind of intense looking at the audience, you know, like there's something, there's an intensity that wants to come out in this, and I'm going to let it. It was written to be such, and then you almost feel the authority when you're performing it.
I was born into a system constructed for failure. It's a sinking ship being manned by drunken sailors. Escape artists behind the bars of a jailer. An asthmatic attack and they withhold the inhaler. If the shoe doesn't fit, what good is a tailor? In the midst of this crisis, please cancel the gala. Without a symphony, there's no need for a prelude to foreshadow what's to come.
You mentioned Portland, which you've lived there for 10 years, I think you said, right?
I'm at eight now, yep.
8 years. How would you say that living in Portland has influenced your music and influenced your lyrics or your creative process? Has the city and the environment of living in that type of city, how has that informed the art that you're making?
Yeah. As best as I can gauge, I think it's been really healthy for me and my wife's journey, you know? It's always weird to talk about a place you're living in sort of an objective way, like pulling out and sort of placing a personality or potentially even a stereotype on the place. So I'm hesitant to say what I'm going to say, but coming from the Midwest, which has its own stereotypes, you know, the backwards, heartland, fundamentalist, whatever you want to say, you know, we saw enough people come out here before us, and we saw for lack of better terms, at times a coldness settle into their heart or their faith. A certain vibrancy, which I would call the first love, sort of seemingly grow dim. Maybe we were wrong, but seemingly. And then so we came out here knowing like something was drawing us, but also with a caution of like, we don't want our love to grow cold, you know? So that's sort of coming out here. That was maybe a simplistic way of viewing the place. And then you live in a place, and a place is dynamic and complex, and there's people all over the spectrum, and it's not as simple as that, you know? But yet at the same time, there is something, I would say, this is my personal opinion, I take it as that there is a similar personality, spirituality, perhaps principality to Vancouver, Canada, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, Cascadia, the Northwest. It's its own place. It is its own place. Those are different cities, but there's a broad swath of a similarity of culture in those places that I've been to enough that I feel like I can say that. A spirituality, which is a good thing. People are like spiritually minded out here, maybe as opposed to like a broad swath of like, sometimes what I see the Northeast is sort of being beyond, more agnostic, more in their heads, you know. West Coast in general, there's a spirituality and openness to things of the spirit that makes it a little bit like a Wild West in some ways. What's good for you is good for you. Let's all be nice and just be spiritual, you know?
Right.
To put it really coarsely. I think coming from the heartland, it was good for me to learn to speak the language of the culture I'm embedded in, which by and large does not believe the same way I do at all. So in some ways, moving out here, there was sort of a sink or swim. Like, you can't sing to the choir out here in a way you can in the Midwest and just be forever invited to little small Christian liberal arts universities and make a living just... you know what I mean?
Right.
Like going to churches and little universities that will applaud what you're saying, and not that what you'd be saying would be weak, but that you could treat your art differently there. Here, like, it was a sink or swim, learn the language. And it was like a few years in, actually, when I was making Love and War, there was sort of this transformation of like, okay, I don't want to compromise what I know is true and living inside of me. But yet there needs to be a way that it works itself out that is in touch with the place that I live in and speaks the language of this place. So, back to your question a few questions back. I think this place trained me in that discourse, which is really good. Because then when you're dealing with your neighbor, as opposed to just sort of this faceless, if you want to just call it the culture of that place. We use that word culture, and it's just sort of this big conglomerate of people. But my neighbors who do not believe the same as I do, and I'm deep friends with, and playing a song like Ulysses for them for the first time, and them tearing up and saying like, man, that song like really, really, you're touching on something that we relate to. And honestly, they know that I'm a Christian, and they'd say like, man, we're not Christians, and we don't believe what you believe, but that song really speaks to something universal.
I'm holding on to the hope that one day this could be made right. 'Cause I've been shipwrecked and left for dead, and I've seen the darkest side.
I meet so many people when I'm traveling and through the breath and the clay, or whether I'm out speaking or performing or doing whatever. I always meet people who they're artists and they have families, and they want to be, they feel a sense of calling to their art as well, obviously to their family. But what encouragement would you give to emerging artists that have families who are also trying to keep their art alive and not letting that just go by the wayside in our daily responsibilities?
That's a good question. That's a good question. In some ways, I'm not a prime candidate to answer that question from experience, because I started my journey as an independent musician as a single college student. And quite literally, my vocation as a musician has grown at the same rate that external responsibilities, getting married, having a kid, having 3 more kids, like my music has grown at that, like, if you want to call it that, sustainable rate. Mm-hmm. So I never had that moment that I know a lot of aspiring musicians have where they're like, man, I'm working this job I hate. I want to get my first album out, like, mm-hmm. How can I make a clean transition from one to the other? And mm-hmm. that's a good question. I have some thoughts, but I never had to make that real drastic transition. Perhaps the moment I talked about earlier where I was like bivocational, pastoring and making music, perhaps that was a crux moment for me that would be similar, where you're putting your full weight, even financially, because really that's what we're talking about as well, is mm-hmm. I feel like I'm called to make music, but how can this support my family?
Yeah.
And how can it support a family without just killing myself on the road, being gone from my family all the time, or whoring myself out for just money anywhere, anyhow? Like, how can I do this with integrity? And it's a really good question, It's a really good question. Something I've said for years is, that phrase, don't despise the day of small things. That, mm-hmm. Oh man, especially when you're beginning, if you're putting out your first release or you're entering into something with fear and trepidation, sometimes I think we want the fast growth because, one, the money's there. We don't have to worry about the money. The validation is there. This was successful. People are applauding it. And it feels like instant, like, affirmation. I made the right choice. Mom and dad don't need to worry. Like, I'm going to provide for my family. And those are noble aspirations, to provide for your family and to have your work gain traction. Those aren't wrong motivations, but I think we need to allow a thing to be small in the beginning. And if you want this thing to be sustainable, like, you need to go about it sustainably, which means building. Mm-hmm. There will be a period where you have to be hungry. And what I mean by that is like saying yes to opportunities, even if they're not high paying, even if they're not being trumpeted on like publications. And there's a time when you say yes. If this is something you feel you're supposed to do, you need to be a little bit hungry on the front end. There's that mm-hmm. proverb, to him who's hungry, even what's bitter tastes sweet. If you're entering into music with all your heart, but saying no to opportunities because you're holding out for like the big festival or mm-hmm. the label to sign you, you might need to reassess like your motives even with the art itself. Are you using the art as a vehicle simply to like grow your name or influence? Is that what mm-hmm. it is? Or do you care about making the work, Because I think if one really cares about the work, you'll be like, man, like stoked that anyone is asking you to come share that work. And my own experience is I shared my work with fear and trepidation as a new believer. Up until that time, I'd done nothing but East Coast monotone hip hop for like 4 or 5 years. And all of a sudden I like believed in this God and was singing songs in falsetto, Mm-hmm. And so I was like scared to share it. And I shared it one funky little Christian cafe at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, from my roommates prodding. And little opportunity after little opportunity came from that one decision to share my work. Mm. And I can honestly say, like, opportunity has all sprung forth from this strange network of saying yes to things. I am at a point now where I have to choose what I say yes to. It's in some ways unfortunate, but in some ways it goes with the territory. Like, mm-hmm. It's grown to a point where I actually have to put things on the scale. What do I have time for? What do I not have time for? What do I sense purpose in? What do I not sense purpose in? And choose accordingly. But early on in the day of small things, there's a sense of like, I don't want to say this insultfully, but like beggars shouldn't be choosers. There's a sense in which like treat yourself as a beggar. That sounds horrible, but like treat yourself as like, man, I'm entering into this as a beggar. Like no artist should be entitled to have listenership. You know, people try to pay for listenership through publicity and through yada, 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 and labels will do that for you. But like, are people asking to hear or see what you're doing? That's a good signifier. Is there actual interest? Or are you trying to like push your stuff out there, pay for your stuff to be heard, get it in the right places, get your foot in the door, quote unquote? Because if that's the way you're starting, that's the way you'll have to continue. And that's actually not sustainable to like force your foot in the door continually. Eventually someone's going to slam the door in your face and say like, you're not allowed in here. Let yourself be called up. Put yourself at the poor place in the feast, like the Lord said. That's been so this right here, this has been the defining parable of my life. When you come into a feast, sit in the least noble place and let the master of the feast say, what are you doing down there? Come up here. He says, so don't put yourself in the place of honor because you'll be demoted in front of everyone when the master of the feast comes in and says, hey, that's not your seat. Go back down there. Wow. And then you go down there shamefully. You know, like put yourself in a lowly place and you will be called up if this is in fact what you're meant to be doing. I guarantee you, if it's what you're meant to be doing, you'll be called up. If it's not what you're meant to be doing, you'll know. You'll know, because it's like the unction to make the work won't be there after you realize it's not connecting. And I've had those things in my life that I really want, that I'm manipulating, that I'm pushing, that I'm funding. I'm trying to make this thing happen, and I realize like, I don't think I'm supposed to be doing this. Like, it's frustrating to me and doesn't seem to be connecting in any worthwhile way out there. And I put it to rest. Like my skateboarding career was essentially that, you know. But I've had other things in my adult life, you know. But man, like, create the work, and when someone says, "Hey, come up here," like at that point, go up, you know. And I guarantee you, if you follow that route, when you're called up, you'll have the strength to carry the responsibility. If you put yourself in a place of authority, responsibility, influence, earning, and you are the one who got yourself there, you will buckle under the pressure, and you will be another casualty of the American entertainment system.
Wow.
Yep.
Dude, that was so good. Yeah.
Let's say it.
That's so good. Yeah. Wow. That's really good. That's really good. I appreciate you going that deep into all that. That was amazing. Well, Josh, thanks so much for sharing with us on Makers and Mystics, and really enjoyed the conversation.
I lost nameless things. My innocence flew away from me. Shit. Had to hide a face from my desire to embrace forbidden fire.
Thanks so much for listening to the Makers and Mystics podcast. This is the conclusion of my conversation with Josh Garrels. I'll be back again in another couple of weeks with another episode for you. In the meantime, visit us at makersandmystics.com and check out some of the past episodes. You can also find links to my work there, where I'll be speaking and performing. And of course, if you'd like to support the creation of these podcasts, you can do that there as well. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you soon.
Always be a place for you at my table. Return